So for the person or people that feel like sharing their story, especially those dark and painful parts, is terrifying, what would you say to that person about how to overcome that fear and why, being able to share your story, especially those difficult parts, is so powerful?
Yeah, so I know for me, the enemy likes to tell lies that you're alone, that you're isolated. He wants to keep you isolated. And it's really easy to believe the lie that nobody's going to understand, people are going to think of you different, fill in the blank of whatever that fear, that narrative is. Um, but for me, I just feel like it's so important to share your story because Jesus spoke in stories. Like he told parables to teach. Like we're wired for stories. You know, when we share our story, we're sharing our testimony and we're sharing about what God has done. And really, our story is one of the only things that people can't take away from us. So, especially when we share our story to glorify God, and in light of the gospel, which is what I help women do. Um, that's that's just the easiest and like the simplest way to share who God is and what He's done in your experience through your own life. And I know for me, the moment I took that very first step, it is scary because you tell yourself these things like, well, what if this and what if that? And they think differently. And for me, especially in this situation, like with my husband, what if they think differently of my husband? Then I'm throwing him under the bus, And while I have a story to tell in this, it's also his story. And so how to really like navigate what's mine and what's his, um, that at the end of the day, for me, Jesus is the most important thing. And I want to be able to glorify him in my story. And if somebody is going to abandon me because of who I am or what I've said or what I've been through or the choices I've made, or if somebody is going to think differently of me or my husband or whatever, then maybe they weren't supposed to be there to begin with. God's going to put people in your life and remove them from your life for lots of different reasons. And I know that I'm just called to share who God is and what Jesus has done in my life, and doing that through my story is the simplest way, and really what God's writing on my life.
Yeah.
So
I think the reason I know for me in my story and my experience in the church, why it's so terrifying to share your story is because it's so against the culture that we're in. Like people don't share the deep, dark stuff. And I mean, you think about that inside the church, that's also amplified outside. You think about who people are on social media and this presentation of themselves or this version of themselves that they're presenting to the world is not who they really are all the time. And so I think for us, we see this polished version inside and outside the church, which then it's like, well, why would I show the unpolished parts of my story? And then when it comes to overcoming that fear, I think one of the easiest ways to find courage is to think about when someone in the past has told their story and how it connected to you. And I don't know, maybe it facilitated self-discovery, maybe it facilitated shame, being dropped off, maybe it made you feel closer to someone in a relationship, maybe it gave you confidence to share that part of your story. Just thinking about how that person sharing their story unlocks something in your story, thinking that I can do that for someone else. I think that that's what I experienced in the group setting, and that's why I love Pure Desire groups, is because it creates that opportunity every single week for you to share your story, bits and pieces that help other people make connections in their own.
Yeah, and sometimes sharing our story is terrifying because we've never done it before. And I don't just mean like publicly on a podcast. I mean those parts of our story that we've not shared with anyone honestly, openly. And that is fearful. That is frightening. And it should be like, it's okay. But just because it's scary doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And so if part of the fright or terror someone's feeling about sharing their story is I've just never really addressed this part of my life, that first step is, who's the safe person? Who's the friend, the family member, the counselor, the pastor that I feel confident I can go to, and maybe for the first time starting to put into words my story, things that happened to me, things I experienced, and looking for how do I start addressing this? Because really until we start addressing it and until we start finding some comfort with being able to tell safe people, we're not going to want to share our story. It's when we start to see wow, in opening up about my story, it's doing something in me, it's doing something for others, that becomes powerful. But, that first time or that first environment, it's like for many of us that had a Pure Desire group, some of those first lessons, maybe on worst moments or secrets or past behaviors, it's like, we'll hear someone say, I've never told anyone this before, but, there's a deep swallow and they go for it. And the aftermath of people's acceptance and affirmation and encouragement is really life shaping. And
Totally.
so just having that courage to say, I think facing and processing my story is worth it, then we might face the fear we have around telling our story.
Yeah.
And you said something, finding that safe person, that trusted friend, that, pastor, whoever. I tell women all the time, like, you can be authentic and sharing your story in its entirety and what God has done, and kind of walking through that without sharing every single detail. That not everybody deserves, a bird's eye view into every detail of your life, especially when it comes to like marriage. But regardless of what that story is, not everybody deserves that, that lens. But to find a trusted person, to find somebody to be able to kind of appropriately share that with. Airing your dirty laundry on social media is not sharing your story. Airing
Yeah.
your laundry. Anytime somebody says, how are you doing? It doesn't have to be well, and then, throw down the list of the things.
Totally.
Vomit.
Although that is a good way to get people to stop asking how you're doing.
Yeah.
If every time they do, you just unload, it's like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not
Good way
asking
to
Nick
shut
that question
conversation down.
anymore. Right. Yeah. Totally.
But yeah, that you can authentically still share and say, well, I'm not great, and there's a lot going on in my marriage, and I just found, like, you can still authentically share daily, and then whether it's in small groups, 7 pillars, betrayal and beyond, or just in any setting, still authentic without kind of giving the whole mess.
Totally. And we've had episodes on that too, that we've talked about. Not everyone, you don't have to share your story with everyone, and why that's important to identify those safe people. But I think there's that fear of like, oh, well, I'm not being authentic. I am being secretive, or I'm isolating by not. And I think there's a difference between isolating and pulling away from community and having wisdom and discernment on, is this person capable or competent enough to understand what I'm saying or respond well? And if the answer is no, that doesn't mean that you're keeping a secret. That means that you're creating a boundary that's helping you remain healthy, for sure.